Nearly 70% of America's rail containers still move on technology invented by one company in 1984. That's American President Lines and its own board's decision to sell the company in 1997 when Wall Street called the deal inevitable, is where this story turns. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly why APL's leadership approved the sale that erased America's Pacific flagship for good. Right now, Washington is racing to rebuild the very American fleet that deals exactly like this one, hollowed out. In 1895, Scottish immigrant Robert Dollar bought his very first ship, a small steam schooner, to haul lumber. He didn't set out to build an American institution. Robert Dollar was a lumberman first and a shipper second, and in 1895, that little steam schooner was just a faster way to move logs down the coast than his rivals could manage. It worked. He bought a second ship, then a third, and within a decade, the Dollar name was on more vessels than almost anyone else sailing the Pacific. By the 1920s, the Dollar Line was running ships completely around the world, mail, cargo, and paying passengers, all under a house flag with a dollar sign painted on the funnel. People called Robert Dollar the grand old man of the Pacific, which sounds like flattery until you realize it was also a warning. Robert Dollar died in 1932, and the company he'd built almost entirely by instinct didn't have a real plan for what came after him. Here is the explanation most people reach for when they hear this company eventually disappeared. Cheap foreign labor, overseas competition, the usual story of American shipping losing to the world. That explanation isn't wrong, it's just too small. It skips two decisions, 60 years apart, that actually decided this company's fate. And neither one was really about who could sail a ship for less. The first decision came in 1938, and it wasn't made by the Dollar family at all. The Depression had gutted Pacific trade, war in China was strangling the routes that used to carry the company's cargo, and Robert Dollar's son couldn't hold the business together the way his father had. It got so bad that one of the company's own flagship liners, the President Coolidge, was seized on the San Francisco waterfront over an unpaid debt of $35,000. It was released only after the company posted a bond of $70,000, just enough money for one final voyage, a humiliating fall for a company that had once circled the entire globe. The United States government stepped in, not as a rescuer out of kindness, but because a functioning Pacific shipping fleet mattered to the country, and this one was about to vanish. The Maritime Commission took 90% of the company's stock, wiped out its debt, and rebuilt it from the wreckage. They gave it a new name, American President Lines, and a new symbol. The dollar sign came off the funnels. In its place went a white eagle. The government installed William Gibbs McAdoo as chairman of the board. McAdoo had been Treasury Secretary under Woodrow Wilson, the country's first Federal Reserve chairman, and a sitting United States Senator from California before he gave up his seat to take the job. This wasn't some obscure appointee. Washington wanted a heavyweight running the company it had just taken over, and it got one. This wasn't a company saved by the free market. It was a company the government built, twice, once by proxy, and once by literally owning it. That detail matters more than it sounds like it should, because 60 years later, when this company needed saving again, the government wasn't the one writing the check. That eagle on the funnel would matter again, decades later, in a way nobody in 1938 could have expected. Everyone assumes this is a shipping company story. It's actually a government creation story that spent the rest of the 20th century quietly forgetting it. For nearly 15 years, American President Lines operated as a federally controlled entity, before a group of investors led by former oil executive Ralph Davies bought it back into private hands in 1952. From that point on, the company behaved like any other ambitious American business, expanding, innovating, and competing. but it never fully shed the thing that built it: a U.S. flag identity and the cost structure that came with keeping American crews on American ships, protected for decades by a federal subsidy most passengers never knew existed. And for a long stretch, that identity looked like an advantage, not a burden. During the war, APL's President-class liners were converted into troop transports, and one of them, the Coolidge, sank in 1942 after striking mines meant for the enemy, carrying close to 5,000 American servicemen. Nearly all of them survived, a fact that became part of company legend for decades, alongside the story of one officer who went back into the sinking ship to pull trapped men out of the infirmary and never made it out himself. After the war, APL rebuilt itself as something closer to a hotel chain that happened to float. The President Cleveland and President Wilson sailed the Pacific advertised as American Hospitality Abroad, each carrying as many as 579 passengers at a time, marketed less like transportation and more like a floating extension of the country itself. Trans-Pacific passenger service, something this company's predecessors had offered since 1867, continued almost unbroken until 1973. But the real transformation wasn't happening in the passenger cabins. It was happening in the cargo holds. American President Lines started experimenting with shipping containers in the early 1950s, years before most of the industry took the idea seriously. And by the 1980s, it had turned that early bet into something the entire freight industry still runs on. In 1984, the company pioneered a way to stack shipping containers too high on specially designed rail cars, moving twice the cargo on the same train. To prove it could be done without damage, the company famously railed a fully set dinner table, crystal and china included, clear across the country without so much as a chipped plate. It sounds like a small engineering trick. It rewired American logistics. Within a few years, double-stacked trains were hauling freight from Los Angeles to Chicago faster and cheaper than anyone thought possible. And by 1988, American President Lines had gone further, building the industry's first container ships too large to fit through the Panama Canal at all, a bet that the future of shipping was bigger, not smaller. The double-stack technology that started as one company's competitive edge became the backbone of American rail freight, the same backbone still carrying most of it today. By the mid-1990s, American President Lines was the second largest container shipping company in the United States, commanding close to a tenth of all cargo moving across the Pacific, pulling in close to $2 billion a year just from ocean freight. It had done what almost no shipping company manages. It had made itself essential to an industry it didn't even fully control. But essential isn't the same as safe. Other carriers had been watching, and by the 1990s, the entire container shipping industry was rearranging itself around one brutal idea: bigger ships, bigger companies, thinner margins. Sealand had helped invent the container business in the first place. Matson dominated the Hawaii and Pacific routes. Evergreen and Maersk were building ships larger than anything APL could afford to match without taking on serious debt. And a smaller carrier out of Singapore, Neptune Orient Lines, was doing something APL couldn't: growing without carrying the cost of American flag crews, American maintenance standards, or an aging fleet of ships bought under a subsidy program that was quietly running out the clock. Owning ships, terminals, and American crews meant APL carried enormous fixed costs no matter how the market moved. A leaner competitor that leased vessels and flagged them wherever labor was cheapest didn't carry that same weight. It could enter a trade lane, undercut on price, and leave again with none of the long-term commitment APL was locked into. In 1996, two major European carriers merged into one giant P&O Nedloyd, And the message to every mid-sized shipping company in the world was unmistakable. Scale wasn't an advantage anymore. It was the entry fee. Companies that didn't have it were going to become targets, acquisitions, footnotes, not because they'd failed, but because they were the right size to be bought and the wrong size to keep competing alone. It wouldn't be the last time this industry consolidated around a company exactly APL's size. 2 decades later, the very carrier that would soon swallow APL got swallowed itself by someone even bigger, the same pattern repeating on a larger scale. This is where people get the timeline wrong. They assume American President Lines collapsed suddenly in 1997, blindsided by a hostile world. It didn't. The crack had already opened years earlier, hidden inside the same success that made the company look unstoppable. To keep competing with those bigger carriers, APL had financed 6 brand new megaships, the C-11 class, some of the largest vessels the company had ever operated, and financing them meant taking on roughly $500 million in new debt. At the exact same time, the rates carriers could charge for moving a container across the Pacific were falling, squeezed by a rate war and a wave of new capacity flooding the market. In just 1 year, the revenue APL earned on every container it moved across the Pacific fell from around $3,400 to roughly $3,100, real money disappearing off every single box the company shipped. And underneath all of it, the 20-year federal subsidy that had helped offset the cost of running American flagships was scheduled to expire at the end of 1997, replaced by a smaller, leaner program that offered far less support. This wasn't bad luck. It was 2 clocks running out at the same time, one financial, one political, and almost nobody outside the company's own filings noticed both were ticking toward the same year. None of these pressures alone would have ended American President Lines. Rate wars come and go. Debt can be managed if revenue holds. Subsidy programs get renegotiated. It was the combination that closed off every exit at once. This is the part that's easy to miss if you've never run a business built around ships instead of a storefront. A vessel you've already financed keeps costing money every single day. Insurance, maintenance, crew, fuel, the loan payment, whether it's full of cargo or half empty. Competitors who leased their ships could shrink their fleets the moment a downturn hit. A PL with 6 new megaships still being paid off could not. The company wasn't losing money because customers stopped wanting to ship with it. It was losing the room to survive a bad year. Start with the ships. The new C-11 megaships were supposed to be the company's advantage, proof it could still compete at the top of the industry. Instead, they became a fixed cost the company couldn't shrink, no matter what happened to shipping rates. $500 million in debt doesn't care whether the market is good or bad. It has to be paid either way. Then the rates kept falling, because everyone in the industry had made the same bet on bigger ships at the same time, and there was simply too much capacity chasing too little cargo. A PL's earnings on the Pacific route, the route the company had built its entire identity around, kept shrinking month over month, even as its debt stayed exactly where it was. Then came the subsidy cliff. For 20 years, the federal government had helped absorb the extra cost of running an American flag fleet. Higher wages, stricter safety standards, more expensive maintenance than a foreign flag competitor would ever have to pay. That protection was set to disappear at the end of 1997. Weeks before the sale, APL had already enrolled 9 of its ships in the government's new, smaller subsidy program, trying to hold on to whatever protection was left. It wasn't enough to change the math. The company was about to lose a cushion it had relied on since before most of its employees were born, at the exact moment its debt load was heaviest and its margins were thinnest. By early 1997, the numbers on paper told an ugly story. PL's own stock was trading at a market value of roughly $325 million, a fraction of what the company's ships, routes, and technology were actually worth. That gap is exactly what a hungry competitor looks for. Neptune Orient Lines did not need to out-innovate American President Lines. It just needed to offer a price the board could not justify refusing. In April of 1997, it did. $33.50 a share, roughly $825 million total, more than double what APL's stock had been trading for on the open market. CEO Timothy Ryan, who had spent years running the company through exactly this pressure, framed the decision the way every executive frames a sale like this, not as surrender, but as the only path to survival in an industry where scale was now the whole game. On Wall Street, people had been calling a deal like this inevitable for years. That is the part that still bothers me. Nobody forced this sale with a gun to anyone's head. The board looked at a company carrying $500 million in fixed debt, a vanishing subsidy, and falling revenue, and decided that selling at a steep premium was the responsible choice, not the desperate one. The company's own records do not show anyone on that board arguing hard against it. They show a group of people united around a business model that had simply run out of good options. That was the decision this whole story has been circling. Not a single villain, not a hidden conspiracy, a board doing the math on a business model that had run out of room to absorb bad news and choosing the exit while there was still a premium on the table. What came after wasn't collapse in the dramatic sense. There was no bankruptcy filing, no auction, no ships sitting empty in a harbor. It was quieter than that, and in some ways more permanent. The sale closed in 1997. PL's own stock, once traded independently on the New York Stock Exchange, stopped existing as its own listing the day the deal closed. Neptune Orient Lines kept the APL name. It was worth more as a brand than it would have been erased, and for a while it even kept the Oakland headquarters. But the independence was gone. In 1999, the company's American rail business, the very stack train network built on that 1984 double-stack breakthrough, was sold off separately for $167 million. In 2009, Oakland's role shrank further. Roughly 100 of the office's 550 employees lost their jobs as the company folded its technology operations into Singapore. The headquarters that had run American shipping in the Pacific for most of a century was no longer where the decisions got made. Then it happened again. In 2016, Neptune Orient Lines, the company that had once needed to buy APL for scale, got bought itself, this time by the French shipping giant CMA-CGM, for roughly $2.4 billion. American President Lines, already once removed from independence, became a subsidiary of a subsidiary. And in October of 2020, the last piece went quiet. CMA-CGM pulled the APL brand out of commercial trans-Pacific shipping entirely. The ships still sail, the name is still painted on their hulls, but APL no longer competes for ordinary cargo customers the way it did for over a century. What's left operates almost exclusively for the U.S. government and a handful of military and Pacific Island routes. A brand kept alive because it's useful, not because it's independent. The name didn't disappear, the company behind it did. None of this happened in a vacuum. Every one of those numbers was somebody's job, somebody's route, somebody's morning commute to a terminal that eventually stopped needing them. The Oakland layoffs in 2009 weren't abstract. Reporting from the time described roughly 100 people losing positions in a single round. An entire technology department eliminated as the work moved overseas. San Francisco Bay's ports had already lost APL's business years earlier in 1996, before the sale even closed as the company shifted its operations elsewhere. And American President Lines wasn't unique in this. Across the whole industry, the number of U.S. merchant mariners collapsed from around 50,000 in 1960 to fewer than 10,000 today, and the Jones Act fleet, ships legally required to be American-built, owned, and crewed, has shrunk from roughly 434 vessels in 1950 to about 90 today. A PL was never part of that domestic fleet, but it lived through the same forces, shrinking government support, and a country that gradually stopped treating merchant shipping like a strategic asset worth protecting. Small importers on the West Coast who had built their businesses around APL's reliable Pacific schedules had to scramble for new carriers almost overnight. Shipping isn't glamorous, but for a small business waiting on a container of inventory, a disrupted carrier can mean a missed shipment, a canceled order, or a customer who doesn't come back. A canceled route or an outsourced department doesn't show up as a headline the way a bankruptcy does. It shows up as a commute that no longer exists, a pension plan absorbed into someone else's, a waterfront office that goes dark one department at a time. That's the part a stock price recovering never fixes. The shareholders who took NOL's premium in 1997 got their payout. The people whose jobs depended on Oakland staying the center of American Pacific shipping did not. Here's why this isn't just a story about one shipping company from the last century. Right now, in 2025, the United States government is trying to do something that should sound familiar: rebuild an American flag merchant fleet that has shrunk to somewhere around 80 ships in international trade, against a Chinese fleet numbering in the thousands. Congress reintroduced the Ships for America Act this year, and the White House rolled out its own Maritime Action Plan, both aimed at the same problem American President Lines lived through twice: a country that built a subsidized shipping industry, then let the subsidy erode, and is now paying to try to rebuild what it once protected for free. It's not just government policy chasing this problem either. The world's biggest ocean carriers spent the last year tearing apart and rebuilding their own alliances. Maersk and the Swiss giant MSC ended their decades-long partnership, and Maersk rebuilt a new one with Hapag-Lloyd instead. The consolidation logic that swallowed APL in 1997 never actually stopped. It just kept moving to the next tier of the industry. And here's the detail that makes this personal to APL specifically. CMA-CGM, the French company that now owns what's left of it, announced in March of 2025 that it would invest $20 billion in the United States and triple its own American flag fleet from 10 ships to 30. A few months later, it reflagged one of its ships, the APL Phoenix, as an American vessel at the port of Charleston. The eagle that the U.S. government put on APL's funnels in 1938 to mark it as a national asset is now being renewed at the discretion of a foreign owner deciding it's good business. So what actually destroyed American President Lines? Not one crisis and not simply foreign competition, even though that's the story most people settle for. It was a board in 1997 staring at $500 million in fixed ship debt, a subsidy program about to disappear, and shrinking revenue on the one trade route the company had built its identity around, and concluding that selling to a foreign buyer at a steep premium was safer than staying independent and betting the company could out-earn its own bills. That decision didn't cause everything that came after, but it closed the door on any version of this story where American President Lines gets to solve its own problems. A PL's ships never stopped flying an American flag. They just stopped being an American decision. If you want more of these, the transportation empires that quietly disappeared behind their own logos, subscribe. It helps more than you'd think. If you ever saw a President-class ship come into port, or worked those Oakland docks yourself, did you know even then who it actually belonged to?